Hey guys, tonight we begin with you, yes you, walking into a Victorian fairground for the very first time. And no, this isn't the kind of fair where you grab a corn dog and watch fireworks while teenagers pretend not to notice each other. Oh no. This is the Victorian age, the era where people thought pouring arsenic into wallpaper was fashionable. And they brushed their teeth with chalk dust because mint hadn't been invented yet. You can almost smell it, can't you? Coal? Smoke in the air, horse manure, decorating the cobblestones like sprinkles on a cake, and everyone's teeth just slightly leaning in their own directions. Now, here's the thing. Victorians were bored out of their corsets. Not TikTok, no Netflix. Not even a sad little meme about a cat falling off a piano. What they had was time. Dangerous amounts of time. And when humans get bored, they get creative and not always in ways you'd expect. So, what did they do for fun? Brace yourself, because you're about to discover that fun, in the 1800s, meant things like competitive corpse watching, hiring people to cry at your funeral, and watching a train wreck. Literally. But let's not spoil all the good stuff too early. Right now, you're walking into that fairground. Picture it. Strings of dim gas lamps casting halos of light, shadowy figures swishing past in stiff dresses and top hats. Someone just dropped a toffee apple, and a rat scurries over to grab it. A violin screeches nearby, not because of bad music, but because apparently bad music was part of the entertainment. And suddenly, you're pulled quite literally towards the center of the crowd. Why? Because tonight's main attraction isn't a magician, or a fire breather, or even a bear on a unicycle. No, tonight's entertainment is people watching other people do weird things. And you're in the perfect spot to see it unfold. The first thing you notice, Victorians had a bizarre love affair with watching public hangings. Yes, entire families packed lunches, grabbed the kids, and strolled out to see a man dropped 6 feet by the neck. Imagine your mom saying, "Don't forget your mittens. Sweetie will be late for the execution." Morbid, absolutely. But to Victorians, this was the equivalent of binge-watching the latest true crime documentary on Netflix. Except this one had popcorn vendors. And here's where it gets even weirder. Some people didn't come to watch the hanging at all. They came to watch the crowd at the hanging. That's right. People found entertainment in other people's reactions. You could say this was the world's first reaction video. Victorians were basically the original YouTubers X. Instead of try not to laugh, it was try not to vomit. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely there were lighter forms of fun. Something charming maybe. Tea parties, croquet, reading by the fireside. Oh, don't worry, those existed. But Victorians had a knack for taking even innocent activities and making them strange. Take seances, for example. You're sitting in a dark room, candles flickering, waiting for Aunt Gertrude to knock 3 times on the table from beyond the grave. Creepy, right? Except for the part where the medium was usually just some dude hiding under the table, wiggling his toes against the wood, and everyone gasped, "The spirits, the spirits." Here's where you start to feel that itch-ta, one that makes you lean forward, that little voice whispering. What else did these people do for fun? And you realize you're just at the surface. You're only on the first ride of this Victorian amusement park. And things are about to spiral into territory so bizarre. You'll wonder how anyone survived the 19th century without accidentally choking on their own hobbies. But before you wander off, take a look at that man by the penny booth. He's scribbling something down furiously, almost like he's recording you. And he is. Because another fun pastime. Victorians loved to spy on strangers and write entire gossip novels about them. Yes, if you lived in 1850, you're awkward. Walk to the bakery could end up serialized in the local paper as The Curious Case of the Limping Gentleman. So, here's where you pause. You've stepped into their world. The air is heavy with mystery, sarcasm practically dripping off every top hat. And you're about to be led deeper, because tonight isn't just about watching Victorians act strange. No, no. Tonight is about you uncovering the truth behind their strangest, most shocking, most sideworthy forms of fun. Things so odd they'll make you laugh, cringe, and maybe clutch your blanket a little tighter. You standing in a parlor, staring at a corpse. Yes, I know, great way to set the mood. But welcome to Victorian fun. This isn't a horror movie. This is a party. And no, you're not hallucinating. The Victorians loved to hang out with the dead. Here's how it worked. Someone in the family would die, which happened a lot, because apparently cholera and tuberculosis were permanent VIP guests in the 19th century. And instead of quietly burying their loved one, Victorians turned funerals into something between a community hangout and a social mixer. Picture it, people chatting, sipping tea, gossiping about neighbors, while the dearly departed is sitting. They're propped up in a chair like an awkward party guest who can't leave. And yes, you're wondering sometimes, they dress the body up. Best suit, neat body, maybe a flower tucked into the lapel. Other times, they'd pose them for post-mortem photographs. That's right. Imagine your cousin dragging you into a family photo, except Uncle George has been dead for 3 days and someone is holding his head up with a stand behind the curtain. The Victorians had a saying, "We must remember the dead," and boy, did they take it seriously. These photos weren't just for remembrance, they were keepsakes. Imagine swiping through someone's Instagram in 1856. Here's my breakfast. Here's my cat. Here's my dead sister propped against the fireplace. Like what? But here's the kicker. Victorians didn't always find this sad. They found it entertaining. If you were wealthy, you hosted elaborate morning parties with music, games, and of course, the star attraction, body, because who doesn't want to sip sherry next to a waxy-faced uncle while discussing the latest gossip about Queen Victoria's hat collection? And then there were the professionals. Yes, you could hire mourners. Entire groups of strangers, dressed in black, paid to come to your funeral and weep dramatically. Imagine blowing your savings so that 30 random people cry louder than your family ever did. Some even brought onions in their pockets to make the tears extra shiny. This wasn't grief, it was performance art. The louder the crying, the better your status in the neighborhood. Basically, if you didn't have wailers at your funeral, were you even Victorian? And let's not forget the games. Oh yes, the Victorians invented party games that made their way into funerals. Card games. Drinking games. Once, in Yorkshire, a parlor game ended with someone accidentally spilling punch on the corpse. That's one way to wake the dead. You glance around this fictional Victorian parlor you're in right now, and you see the absurdity. One person is solemnly praying, another is laughing hysterically, someone else is sketching the body for their scrapbook. You're realizing these people didn't see death as an end. They saw it as, well, free entertainment. And here's the thing. You're starting to notice a pattern. Victorians had this obsession with blending the morbid and the merry. They didn't separate scary from fun. They wove them together like lace. It's as if they asked themselves, what's the weirdest, darkest, most socially uncomfortable thing we could do? And then, they did it. Proudly now, here's where the paranoia kicks in. You shift uncomfortably. Because suddenly you realize, you're not just a guest at this funeral, you're being watched. A woman with a lace veil keeps glancing at you. Her lips curl into a smile, almost like she knows you don't belong here. And then you hear the click of a camera. Someone's taking your picture. Not just a picture, your post-mortem photograph. Which makes you wonder, are you the guest? Or are you the entertainment? And that's exactly how Victorians wanted you to feel, caught between fascination and fear. But hold on to that unease, because the rabbit hole goes deeper. If they could laugh next to corpses, imagine what they did when they weren't mourning at all. Hint. It involves dangerous games, bizarre contests, and sometimes actual explosions. A game, not just any game, but one that could literally end with someone catching on fire. And no, I'm not exaggerating. This was the Victorian definition of fun. You thought Monopoly was brutal. You thought Uno could end friendships. Please. Victorians looked at board games and said, cute. Now let's make something that might burn down the house. Welcome to Snapdragon, the party game that sounds innocent, but was basically a fiery death trap disguised as holiday cheer. Here's how it worked. You pour a big bowl of brandy, toss in some raisins, light the entire thing on fire, and then, because apparently no one in the 19th century valued their fingerprints, you take turns sticking your hands into the flames to snatch out raisins. If you manage to eat one without losing an eyebrow, congratulations, you won. If not, well, at least you gave the spectators a laugh while you screamed, and people loved it. Families played Snapdragon at Christmas, kids included. Imagine little Timmy sticking his face near an open fire, because fun. You can almost hear the parents cheering, "Don't be a coward, son. Grab that flaming raisin." Honestly, I'm convinced the only reason more Victorians didn't die was because their houses were already freezing cold. But Snapdragon was just the beginning. Victorians had a whole catalog of games that straddled the line between entertainment and insurance liability. Take Hot Cockles, a game where one person blindfolds themselves, kneels on the floor, and everyone else takes turns slapping them on the back as hard as they can. The blindfolded player has to guess who hit them. Sound fun? Sure, if you're into random acts of violence disguised as party bonding. Or, how about bullet pudding? Spoiler, not actual pudding. You'd make a giant mound of flour, stick a bullet on top, and everyone had to take turns slicing away at the mound with a knife. Whoever caused the bullet to fall had to retrieve it using only their mouth, which, of course, meant plunging your face into a pile of flour, while everyone else laughed as you inhaled half a pound of dust. If you survived without choking, congrats, you won humiliation and mild lung damage. And then there were the endurance games. Victorians adored proving their toughness. Like the laughing game, where you had to sit stone-faced while everyone tried to make you laugh, lose composure, and you lost. Simple enough, right? Except sometimes the punishments for laughing included things like being forced to drink vinegar, sing a ridiculous song in public, or my personal favorite, walk around the party pretending to be a donkey for the rest of the night. Imagine trying to flirt with someone while braying on command. But wait, it gets darker. Because nothing says party starter like mock executions. Yes, in certain circles, Victorians thought it was hilarious to stage fake beheadings or hangings. Someone would play the victim, others would act as the executioner, and everyone else would howl with laughter while the poor volunteer pretended to die dramatically. Funniest part, sometimes the props malfunctioned, and what was meant to be pretend ended up alarmingly real. Victorians, inventors of slapstick death comedy. And here's the twist, you can feel it, right? This wasn't just silliness. These games revealed something about the Victorian psyche. They lived in a world constantly brushed by death plagues, accidents, industrial disasters. Maybe playing with fire and fake executions was their way of laughing in the face of mortality. Or maybe they were just nuts. Now imagine you at one of these parties. The room is warm with the glow of gas lamps. Everyone is shrieking with laughter as someone plunges their head into flour. The air smells like burnt raisins. And just when you think you're safe in the corner, someone taps your shoulder. Your turn for hot cockles. You step forward, nervously, blindfold, tied, and suddenly, one fall. The slap nearly knocks you off your knees. Everyone bursts into laughter. You're stinging, embarrassed, but you can't help smiling, because in some weird way, you get it. You're part of the joke now, and that's when it hits you. The Victorians weren't just having fun. They were bonding through chaos, pain, and absurdity. Their games were proof that humans will go to any lengths, to avoid being bored. But here's the kicker. If you thought fire games and slap-happy guessing were bizarre, wait until you hear what Victorians considered spectator sports. Because their idea of watching a show makes football look tame. The sound of cheering, roaring, bone-rattling cheering, like you've just stepped into a Victorian Coliseum. But forget football. Forget basketball. You're standing in front of something so strange, so jaw-droppingly bizarre, that your brain struggles to process it. Because here in the 1800s, entertainment wasn't touchdowns and three-pointers. It was rats versus dogs. Yes. Welcome to the rat pits. Picture this, a wooden arena in some smoky pub basement. A writhing, squealing pile of rats dumped into the pit. And then cue the star of the show, a terrier. The crowd presses in, gas lamps flickering, coins changing hands. The bet. How many rats can the dog kill in under a minute? Cheers explode as the terrier lunges, snapping necks, tossing bodies like rag dolls. The bookie yells out times. People scream for blood. And you UAR shoulder chuler, with gentlemen in top hats who are losing their minds like it's the Super Bowl halftime show. And the weirdest part, this wasn't underground crime. This was a popular pastime. There were even celebrity dogs. I'm not kidding. A terrier named Billy once killed 100 rats in under 6 minutes and was basically the Michael Jordan of rat baiting. Imagine posters of him in parlors. Kids collecting cards. Oh wow, Billy's stats are insane this season. But wait, it gets wilder. Rat pits were just the warm-up. Because Victorians weren't content with dog versus rat, they wanted bigger, stranger, more dangerous. Which brings us to train wrecks. Actual train wrecks. No, not accidents, planned ones. Promoters would buy 2 decommissioned locomotives, set up a massive outdoor arena, and then advertise. Come one, come all. Watch trains smash head-on at full speed. Families showed up with picnics. Vendors sold lemonade. Tens of thousands of people gathered to watch 2 40-ton monsters collide. In a firestorm of twisted metal, it was chaos. The crash shook the ground. Sparks flew, iron shattered, people screamed with delight. And when the smoke cleared, spectators rushed the tracks to grab souvenirs, chunks of steel, splinters of wood, whatever they could pocket, because apparently, nothing said fun day out like risking shrapnel to the face. But that's not all. Victorians also loved human endurance shows. Imagine sitting in a packed theater, watching a guy eat nails, swallow fire, or walk barefoot across broken glass. Today we'd call it a circus sideshow. Back then, it was just Tuesday. And of course, we can't forget the walking contests. Yes, professional walking was a thing. Thousands of people turned up to watch men walk in circles for days. Literally, the goal. Walk the longest distance without stopping. People fainted, hallucinated, collapsed, and the crowd ate it up. Bookies placed bets. Fans cheered for their favorite walkers, and newspapers covered it like the World Cup. Now imagine yourself in one of these crowds. You're pressed against strangers, the smell of sweat, beer, and horse dung thick in the air. Your ears ring from cheering. Part of you thinks, this is insane. But another part is exhilarated. Because you can't look away. And that's the magic trick. Victorians knew how to turn anything rats. Wrecks walking into a spectacle. But here's the question buzzing in your head right now. Why? Why were Victorians obsessed with watching danger, death, and destruction? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Life was already brutal. Industrial accidents, disease, poverty, death was everywhere. Maybe by turning horror into a show, Victorians made it feel less terrifying. Or maybe they were just addicted to the shock. Either way, you've seen enough tonight to realize something chilling. The Victorians weren't just bored. They were hungry for chaos, for danger, for anything that jolted them out of the monotony of suit-covered life. And just when you think you've wrapped your head around it, someone tugs your sleeve. A man in a crooked bowler hat leans in and whispers. You standing in the corner of a dimly lit Victorian drawing room, clutching a lukewarm cup of tea, desperately trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Why? Because this is a Victorian courtship party, and you're about to witness how the most buttoned-up, repressed people in history tried to find love. Spoiler alert, it's not roses and candlelight, it's awkward silences, secret codes, and sometimes straight-up weirdness. Let's start with the language of the fan. Yes, that dainty little accessory Victorian women carried wasn't just for cooling off while trapped in a corset. It was basically Tinder, but with more elbow cramps. Every flick, snap, and wave of the fan sent a secret message. Fan, half opened, and covering the mouth, kiss me. Fan twirling in the left hand. We are being watched. Fan dropped on the floor. I hate you. Goodbye. Basically, it was like trying to flirt entirely in Morse code while sweating under 30 pounds of fabric. And then there were calling cards. Imagine business cards. But instead of LinkedIn connections, they were used for dating. A gentleman interested in a lady would leave his card at her home. If she was into him, she'd send her card back. If she wasn't, the butler would politely say, Miss is not at home. Translation, she's absolutely home. She just doesn't want to see your face. Brutal, but nothing tops the Victorian parlor games that doubled as flirting rituals. Remember hot cockles from before, the one where everyone slaps you? Well, some parlor games were basically excuses for physical contact in a world where touching someone's hand was considered scandalous. Take Kiss in the Ring. A group of people stood in a circle while one person ran around it, stopping to kiss someone of their choice. The kissed person then chased them, trying to catch them for a kiss back. It was basically Spin the Bottle, but with more running, more sweat, and way more layers of clothing. Imagine trying to sprint in a hoop skirt while being chased for a smooch. Sexy? No. Hilarious? Absolutely. Another game was the Minister's Cat. This was less physical, but just as weird. Players sat in a circle and took turns describing the minister's cat with increasingly ridiculous adjectives. The minister's cat is an adorable cat. The minister's cat is a bashful cat. The minister's cat is a cunning cat. Run out of adjectives. You're out. The fun was watching your crush panic under pressure while everyone laughed. Ah, yes. Nothing says romance like social humiliation. But here's where things get dark. Some Victorian couples took courtship games to bizarre extremes. There are accounts of lovers exchanging locks of hair, which sounds cute until you realize people often sent entire braids. Yes, chunks of hair kept in lockets, framed on walls, or even woven into jewelry. Imagine unwrapping a gift from your sweetheart only to find their scalp in bracelet form. And it didn't stop there. Victorians also exchanged teeth. Baby teeth, extracted teeth, molars, teeny tokens of affection. Imagine a necklace that when you walk, because it's literally made of human teeth. Sweet, romantic, or just straight up horror movie material. You decide. Now picture you at this party. The music is soft, a piano plinking in the background. Ladies are fluttering fans like semaphore flags. Men are nervously fingering their calling cards. Suddenly, someone suggests a round of Kiss in the Ring. Your stomach drops. A lady in a lavender gown darts toward you, plants a quick kiss on your cheek, then bolts. The room erupts in laughter, and you realize you're blushing. Because for a second, you actually felt it. The thrill, the risk, the absurdity of Victorian flirting. But here's the thing. Beneath the lace and coated fans, the Victorians weren't that different from us. They were just trying to connect, to impress, to feel wanted. Only, they did it while bound by etiquette so strict that even eye contact could send shockwaves. Imagine living in a world where making small talk at a funeral was easier than asking someone on a date, and yet don't get comfortable. Because love and flirting were only the polite forms of fun. The deeper we go, the stranger it gets. You're about to learn what Victorians did, not just in the parlor, but in the shadows, behind closed doors, rituals so bizarre, you'll wish it stayed a secret. The lights going out. Not because of a power cut, this is the 1800s. Remember, but because someone in the parlor just blew out the last candle. The air smells of hot wax and damp velvet curtains. You feel the room tighten as everyone leans forward, hands clasped, breaths shallow. Why? Because tonight's entertainment isn't cards, or kissing games, or flaming raisins. It's the afterlife. Welcome to the seance. This, my friend, was the party trick of the Victorian era. Forget Netflix and chill, this was summon ghosts. And maybe faint dramatically. Tables knocking, trumpets floating, ghostly hands brushing cheeks. The Victorians loved it. Spiritualism wasn't some fringe hobby. It was a cultural obsession. Even Queen Victoria herself was rumored to have dabbled in spirit communication after Prince Albert died. And here's the part that makes you smirk. Most seances were absolutely fake. The medium, that mysterious person in the middle, was basically a Victorian stage magician with better marketing. They hid bells in their skirts, used wires to make objects fly, or simply banged their knees under the table. Imagine paying good money just to watch someone shake the furniture. But the audience ate it up. Why? Because seances gave them hope. Remember, death was everywhere. Families lost children to diphtheria. Miners were crushed in tunnels. Trains derailed weekly. The afterlife wasn't an abstract question, it was dinner table conversation. If you could pay a guinea to speak to your dead grandmother, even if she just told you to eat your vegetables from beyond the veil, you'd do it. Now, imagine you at one of these gatherings. The parlor is silent. Everyone's hands are joined. On the table, the medium begins to moan softly. A sudden knock. A candle flickers. Someone gasps, "It's Uncle Harold." You want to laugh, it's so obviously staged, but then, just for a second, the room grows cold. A draft brushes your neck. Was that real? Or did your imagination just betray you? And seances were only the beginning. Victorians invented entire industries around the supernatural. Ever heard of spirit photography? It was all the rage. A photographer would take your portrait, then accidentally develop a blurry figure hovering over your shoulder. Look, Aunt Mildred came to visit from the beyond. People actually displayed these photos proudly in their homes. Today we'd call it Photoshop. Back then, it was proof of life after death. There were also ghost clubs. Yes, actual gentlemen's societies, dedicated to ghost hunting. They met in creaky old houses, drank brandy, and swapped ghost stories like middle-aged podcasters. Some went further, staying overnight in haunted mansions, daring each other to walk dark corridors with only a candle. You can picture it now. A stiff man in a cravat, shrieking when the wind rattled a window pane. But wait, it gets stranger. The Victorians didn't just chase ghosts for thrills. They wove the supernatural into everyday fun. Dinner parties ended with impromptu tea leaf reading, palmistry. Ouija boards. It was as casual as playing charades. Want to know if your crush likes you back? Forget texting, just ask the spirits. And here's where it gets deliciously ironic. Half the guests believed, half didn't. But everyone played along. Because even if you didn't believe in ghosts, pretending you did made the night more entertaining. Victorians loved living in that blurred space between skepticism and wonder. Now lean in, because here's the creepy part. Some seances went wrong. One famous medium was exposed when her spirit voice was discovered to be her husband speaking through a tube. Another was caught stuffing glowing cheesecloth in her mouth and pretending it was ectoplasm. But sometimes, the lights went out, the knocks came, and something unexplainable really did happen. Enough to make even skeptics shiver. So picture yourself leaving that seance tonight. The gas lamps outside look dimmer. The cobblestones echo under your boots. A shadow flits across the street. You tell yourself it's just your imagination, but deep down, you wonder if you carried something home with you. And that's the trick, isn't it? The Victorians turned fear itself into entertainment. They laughed, they gasped, they shivered, and, for one night, boredom didn't exist. But hold on tight. Because if you thought seances were eerie, wait until you see how Victorians treated their food. Yes, their dining habits were a spectacle all their own. Full of odd rituals, strange recipes, and more than a few things that should have stayed off the menu. The clatter of silverware on porcelain, the low hum of polite conversation, and a massive chandelier dangling above your head that looks one good sneeze away from falling. Congratulations, you've just been seated at a Victorian banquet, and trust me, you're not ready for what's about to be placed in front of you. First up, hedgehog pudding. Don't panic, it wasn't an actual hedgehog. Most of the time. It was a bizarre dessert, molded into the shape of a hedgehog, with almond slivers poking out like spines. Cute, maybe. Tasty, questionable. Nightmarish, if you got drunk and woke up thinking the hedgehog was real. Absolutely. And then there were the jellies. Oh, the jellies. If you've ever seen a modern-day Jell-O mold at a church potluck and thought it was tacky, you need to know Victorians took gelatin art to a level that can only be described as culinary madness. Whole banquets showcased wobbling towers of translucent jelly, shaped like castles, pyramids, or even human hands. Sometimes, meat was suspended inside the jelly. Imagine cutting into dessert and finding a chicken wing floating in there like some prehistoric fossil. Delicious. But food wasn't just about eating, it was about the show. Ever seen a pie that explodes? Victorians had a party trick where a giant pie crust would be placed on the table, and when cut open, live birds flew out. Yes, actual birds. Straight from whimsical to health hazard in one slice. The room filled with feathers, people laughed, and everyone pretended not to think about bird poop landing in the gravy. And let's not forget the Victorians' obsession with weird recipes. Roasted swan, boiled calf's head, eel pie, turtle soup. If it moved, they cooked it. If it didn't move, they covered it in lard until it did. There's even a documented recipe for sheep's feet jelly. Imagine your date scooping quivering sheepfoot goo into their mouth while locking eyes with you. Romance at its finest. Now here's the kicker. The rules of Victorian dining were as strange as the food itself. For example, you were not allowed to cut your bread with a knife. You had to break it by hand. Soup. You had to scoop the spoon away from you, never toward you, or risk being branded a savage. And God forbid you asked for salt to be passed apparently. That was the height of rudeness, and the pressure was real. These banquets weren't just meals, they were social survival tests. Each course was a chance to prove you had class, refinement, and the ability not to faint at the sight of jellied cow tongue. Fail, and people whispered about you for weeks. You weren't just eating dinner, you were auditioning for society. Now picture you at this dinner table. You're trying to look casual, while holding your fork in exactly the right way, prongs down, always prongs down. A waiter plops down a plate in front of you, and it's turtle soup. You freeze. Everyone's watching. Do you sip, slurp, cry? You muster the courage, take a spoonful, and instantly regret it. It tastes like pond water with seasoning. The lady across the table smirks knowingly, as if to say, "Yes, darling, that's the flavor of prestige." And just when you think you've survived the worst, the butler carries out the piece de resistance, a towering jelly sculpture, glowing amber under candlelight, wobbling like it's possessed. Everyone claps. You clap too, though part of you wonders if it's going to sprout legs and walk off the table. Here's the strange truth. Victorian dining wasn't about the food. It was about the spectacle. The stranger, the dish, the more impressive the host. Eating became theater, and every guest was both audience and actor. But before you push back from the table, know this: the weirdness of Victorian banquets didn't end with food. Their obsession with status and spectacle spilled into fashion. And that is where the true madness begins. The sound of fabric swishing, corset strings tightening, and the faint ominous crack of someone's ribs giving way. Yes, welcome to the wild, wonderful, and absolutely unhinged world of Victorian fashion. Now, let's get one thing straight. You think you look good in skinny jeans? Please. Victorians were out here risking actual death for fashion trends. And the first culprit, the corset. Oh, the corset. It wasn't just a garment, it was a religion. Women, and sometimes even men, themselves up so tightly that their waists shrank to terrifying proportions. I'm talking about my vital organs are now stacked on top of each other like Tetris blocks tight. Fashion magazines of the time praised waists as small as 15 inches. For perspective, that's smaller than most people's necks. Doctors back then noticed women fainting constantly. Society pretended it was because they were delicate. In reality, their lungs had about as much room to expand as a goldfish in a shot glass. Fainting couches became popular furniture, not because women were fragile, but because they were literally passing out every 15 minutes, thanks to their corsets. But that's not even the worst of it. Tight lacing deformed ribs, shifted spines, and in some cases, permanently damaged livers. Autopsies of heavy corset wearers showed livers with deep grooves in them, shaped like the ribs pressing down. Imagine your liver looking like it was squished through a waffle iron, all for the sake of being fashionable. Now, if corsets weren't enough, let's talk about these were giant, cage-like structures made of steel and whalebone that women wore under their skirts to make them look bigger, because apparently, nothing screams elegance like taking up as much space as possible. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. These skirts were enormous. Walking through doorways. Nightmare. Sitting down. Forget it. But the real danger was fire. Skirts made of highly flammable fabrics, plus open fireplaces, plus candles, equals disaster. Thousands of women died because their dresses literally burst into flames. There are actual newspaper reports of entire parties where one guest's skirt caught fire, and it spread like a chain reaction. Talk about killer fashion. And the Hatso boy. Victorians had a love affair with birds. But not live birds. Dead ones. Entire taxidermied birds were sewn onto women's hats. Picture yourself walking down the street with a sparrow. Wings outstretched, perched on your head like you're auditioning for Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. It wasn't just feathers, it was the whole bird. Conservationists of the time begged people to stop. Women said, "Nah, but it looks cute." Fashion. 1. Wildlife. 0. And don't think the men were off the hook. Gentlemen had their own deadly accessories. Top hats were lined with mercury to stiffen the felt. Over time, mercury poisoning turned many stylish men into twitching, hallucinating wrecks, hence the phrase, mad as a hatter. Yes, Victorian men were literally going insane for fashion. But wait, it gets even darker. Bright clothing dyes were all the rage, especially the color green. Victorians adored a shade called Shields green, which looked gorgeous but had one tiny problem. It was made with arsenic. Yep. People wore arsenic dresses, gloves, and even shoes. Some ladies developed mysterious sores and blisters just from wearing their gowns. Factory workers, making the dyes, often died from exposure. All because people wanted to glow, literally, in a pretty poison shade of green dot. Now, put yourself in these outfits. You're laced up so tightly your organs are screaming. You're balancing a dead pigeon on your head. Your skirt is wide enough to block traffic. And your dress might burst into flames or poison you at any moment. Sounds ridiculous, right? But to Victorians, this wasn't ridiculous, it was status. If you could afford to suffer for fashion, you were winning. Imagine yourself walking into a ballroom. You sweep in, skirts swaying, corsets singed, heads turn. Everyone whispers, "Wow, what a vision." What they don't see is your lungs begging for air, your feet numb from tiny pointed shoes, and the constant fear that if someone lights a cigar too close, you're about to become human tinder. But hey, at least you look fabulous. And here's the ironic twist: despite all the pain, despite the fainting, the burns, and the madness, Victorian fashion was worshipped. The tighter, the brighter, the more dangerous, the better. It was less about comfort and more about performance. You weren't just dressing, you were putting on a show for the world. But fashion was only one stage of the performance. Victorians had another obsession: entertainment. The room going silent, the lights dimming, and a woman at the head of the table, whispering, "Is there anyone here with us tonight?" Welcome to the Victorian seance, where fun and horror joined hands, literally. See, Victorians were obsessed with death. Maybe it was because people died so often, and so young: disease, childbirth, accidents, you name it. Death was practically a house guest. So, naturally, people wanted to believe they could still chat with Aunt Margaret or little Jimmy on the other side. Enter the spiritualist movement. Mediums, mostly women, claimed they could speak with the dead. And the public ate it up. Imagine yourself in a candlelit parlor, sitting around a heavy oak table with a group of strangers. The medium closes her eyes. Everyone holds hands. The room fills with whispers, sighs, knocks from nowhere. Suddenly, the table trembles. Someone gasps. A bell rings, but no one touched it. And then you feel a hand brush your shoulder. Now you and I know, these were parlor tricks. Mediums were basically the Penn and Teller of their day, except instead of pulling rabbits out of hats, they pulled ectoplasm out of their mouths literally. They would regurgitate long strands of cheesecloth in the dark, and claim it was ghostly substance. I wish I were kidding. But people believed. Even the smartest minds of the age, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was convinced seances were real. Meanwhile, Harry Houdini, the famous escape artist, made it his life's mission to expose fraudulent mediums. Their feud was legendary. And if seances weren't your cup of tea, Victorians had plenty of other bizarre entertainments. Let's talk about freak shows now. Today, the idea feels cruel. But in the 1800s, this was prime-time entertainment. People paid money to gawk at so-called oddities. You'd see conjoined twins, bearded ladies, giants, and living skeletons. P.T. Barnum built an empire on it. He even once displayed a woman he called George Washington's 161-year-old nurse. Spoiler, she wasn't. But here's the twist: you might think the performers were victims. Yet many of them actually found agency and success in the freak show circuit. Some earned more than doctors or lawyers of their day. People like Charles Stratton, better known as General Tom Thumb, became international celebrities, meeting royalty and living lavish lives. It was exploitation, yes, but also sometimes opportunity. If you wanted something even weirder, you could visit the wax museums. Madame Tussauds was the blockbuster of its time. But forget the modern family-friendly vibe back then. It was terrifying. They called it the Chamber of Horrors. Inside, you'd see wax figures of guillotined heads, serial killers, and gruesome crime scenes, displayed in grotesque detail. Imagine bringing your date there. Nothing says romance like gazing at waxwork, Marie Antoinette's decapitated head. And then, of course, there were public dissections. Yes, really. If you couldn't afford theater tickets, you could always attend a live dissection of a criminal's body. Doctors would slice open corpses while crowds of spectators cheered, laughed, or fainted. Think of it as a crossover between Grey's Anatomy and WWE. But maybe you didn't want gore. Maybe you just wanted thrills. Victorians also loved ghost shows, early horror theater. These used Pepper's Ghost, a clever mirror trick, to make phantoms appear on stage. Imagine sitting in a crowded theater when suddenly a glowing, transparent figure floats across the stage. People screamed, fainted, even fled the theater. And yet they came back for more. So picture it. You, in your corset or arsenic green dress, walking into a dark parlor for a seance. The air smells of candle wax and nervous sweat. You're holding hands with strangers, waiting for a dead loved one to speak. The medium begins humming. The table rattles. A trumpet floats in midair. Everyone gasps. Do you believe it's real? Or do you laugh, knowing someone's crouched under the table with a string? That's the thing. Victorian fun was never simple. It always walked a tightrope between awe and absurdity, between genuine belief and obvious trickery. They didn't just want entertainment. They wanted to be scared. They wanted to be fooled. They wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was possible. But here's the kicker. The deeper you go into Victorian entertainment, the more it feels like a mirror. Because don't we still crave the same things today? Don't? We binge horror movies, watch ghost hunters on YouTube, or line up for haunted houses. The Victorians just had worse lighting, deadlier props, and way more arsenic. A quiet evening in a Victorian drawing room. The fire crackles. Tea is poured. A group of friends sit around, not scrolling TikTok, not binging Netflix, because obviously, those didn't exist. No, their entertainment came from games. But not the wholesome board games you're picturing. Oh no, Victorians had their own brand of strange, awkward, and occasionally dangerous fun. Let's start with something called Snapdragon. Imagine this. A bowl filled with raisins is placed on the table. Sounds nice, right? Now set those raisins on fire. Yes, actual flames. The room glows blue as brandy-soaked fruit burns, and the players, usually children, have to snatch the flaming raisins with their bare hands and pop them into their mouths before the fire goes out. I'm not making this up. The game was basically who can burn their face first. It was all the rage at Christmas, and if that wasn't enough, fire hazard, they also played something called hot cockles. One poor soul would kneel on the ground, face buried in someone's lap, while others lined up to smack them on the back. The kneeling person had to guess who hit them. It was a mix of pain, humiliation, and guessing game. Basically, a Victorian drinking game without the drinks. But maybe you weren't into pain or burns. In that case, how about the laughing game? This one went like this. One person would say, ha. The next added, ha ha. The third, ha ha ha. And so on, until someone broke down giggling. Sounds harmless, right? Except in Victorian times, laughter was considered dangerously close to hysteria. Doctors worried that women might damage their nerves by laughing too much. Imagine getting a medical bill because you chuckled too hard. And then there was blind man's buff, you know. The innocent game where one person's blindfolded and has to catch the others. Except in Victorian parlors, the blindfolded person often stumbled into fragile oil lamps, heavy curtains, or sharp furniture. Broken noses and black eyes were common souvenirs of an evening's play. Victorians weren't just playing games, they were accidentally inventing household. insurance claims. But games weren't the only form of entertainment. Victorians also loved their gadgets. And let me tell you, their version of fun tech makes your smartphone look boring. Take the zoetrope for example. A spinning drum with little slits cut into it, inside of which were drawings in sequence. Peer through while it spun, and voila, you had moving pictures. It was the Netflix of 1840. People would sit for hours, hypnotized by a stick figure doing jumping jacks. Or the stereoscope. You looked through a pair of lenses at two slightly different photos, and your brain fused them into one 3D image. Victorians were obsessed with this. They collected stereograph cards of exotic lands, monuments, even celebrities. Imagine Instagram, but you could only view one photo at a time, in 3D, through a wooden box. And if you were feeling a little morbid, Victorians loved post-mortem photography. Families would prop up their deceased loved ones, pose them in lifelike ways, and snap a photo. Sometimes the living relatives were blurry in the photo because they moved, while the dead subject looked perfectly sharp. Creepy, yes, but it gave grieving families a way to keep their loved ones forever. Victorian hobbies didn't stop there. They also loved collecting, not stamps, not Pokemon cards, but hair, human hair. People would weave locks of hair into jewelry, wreaths, even framed art. Imagine walking into someone's home and seeing a massive, intricate wreath on the wall made entirely of their dead aunt's curls. It wasn't considered creepy. It was sentimental. And then, of course, there were parlor experiments. Amateur science was all the rage. You might attend a party where someone demonstrated static electricity by making your hair stand on end. Or you might watch a magnetism show where objects mysteriously moved. Basically, science mixed with party tricks. Bill Nye meets seance. But here's the weirdest part. All these parlor entertainments, from flaming raisins to hair art, weren't just distractions. They were a way for Victorians to test limits, to dance at the edge of danger, to poke fun at death, to marvel at science just before it was understood. Now, imagine yourself in that room. You're sitting by the fire, a plate of burnt fingertips from Snapdragon at your side, while your host proudly shows you their collection of hair jewelry. You've laughed too hard at the laughing game, and you're secretly worried your doctor will scold you. And as you look around at your friends, flushed with candlelight and adrenaline, you realize this isn't just fun. This is survival in disguise. In a world where death was always knocking at the door, the Victorians turned their parlors into miniature laboratories of fear, laughter, and control. Here we leave the roaring crowds and step into the more intimate, eccentric, and downright weird side of Victorian fun. The hush of a drawing room after the fox hunt ends, when the boots are muddy, the horses are stabled, and the gentlemen slip inside, smiling slyly, as if the real fun is only just beginning. You'd think Victorians would collapse into bed after all that outdoor chaos. Wrong. That's when the secret hobbies came out. Let's start with one of the strangest: collecting hair. Yes, actual human hair. Victorians would clip locks of hair from loved ones, sometimes living, sometimes dead, and weave them into elaborate jewelry. Rings, necklaces, even picture frames. Imagine sitting at a friend's house, sipping tea, and casually noticing that the brooch on her chest is woven from the golden curls of her dead cousin. Morbid, yes, but also fashionable. The Victorians treated death like a craft supply store. Then there was garden crypt games. You might wander into a friend's garden expecting roses and daisies, only to find a miniature graveyard. Families literally planted fake tombstones and staged little funerals for entertainment. Some did it to joke about mortality, others as a kind of rehearsal for the real thing. Either way, you'd be kneeling among marigolds, play-acting your own death while neighbors applauded. And speaking of pretending, Victorians loved a good masquerade. But these weren't the elegant ballroom affairs you're picturing. No, some were weird. Imagine a dinner party where every guest had to dress as an insect. You walk in wearing antennae made from wire and cork, your friend buzzing around with paper wings, another guest crawling on all fours as a beetle. The food beetle themed too. That's not just fun, that's a fever dream with punch bowls. But the strangeness doesn't end there. Oh no, my friend. Have you ever heard of table turning? Picture this. A group of Victorians sit around a table, fingertips lightly resting on the wood. The lamps are dimmed. Suddenly, the table begins to tremble, shudder, maybe even rise an inch. Off the ground, the spirits. They cry. Spiritualism wasn't just a belief, was party entertainment. Guests would summon ghosts for fun, scribble automatic messages, or watch as someone fainted dramatically in contact with the beyond. Seances were less about religion and more about thrill-seeking. And if you wanted something less spooky, how about taxidermy tea parties? Yes, people dressed up stuffed animals in little costumes, staging scenes of squirrels playing poker or kittens hosting luncheons. These grotesque displays were shown off to guests like conversation pieces. Imagine sipping your tea while staring into the glass eyes of a rat dressed as a soldier. Delightful. Now, let's wander into one of the most infamous amusements, opium dens. Not just for the lower classes aristocrats to slip into shadowy rooms, reclining on couches, inhaling smoke, and drifting into dreamy hallucinations. For some, it was escapism. For others, it was scandalous thrill. Either way, it shows that even when Victorians pretended to be moral, they were also experimenting with altered states of mind. But maybe you weren't into drugs. Maybe you wanted exercise, but indoors. Enter parlor gymnastics. Families set up contraptions in their living rooms, ropes. Bar-soaked guests could swing and show off acrobatic tricks after dinner. Ladies in corsets hanging upside down, men attempting flips, children daring each other to climb higher. It wasn't always graceful. It was often hilarious. And sometimes, someone cracked a rib. Fun, right? And then there's private punishment. Games, oh yes. Some Victorian couples turned discipline into play. Reports survive of parties where adults dared each other to endure canings, ice baths, or being locked in cupboards. The line between fun, humiliation, and something more intimate got very blurry. But of course, everyone laughed it off as a joke. Even the respectable hobby of photography turned strange behind closed doors. Families staged eerie portraits, with mannequins, corpses, or tricked double exposures to make it look like ghosts stood beside them. And don't forget, hidden mother photography, where children were photographed while their mothers, disguised under draped sheets, held them still. The result? Pictures of babies with looming shadowy figures behind them, unintentionally. Nightmare fuel. So here's the thing. Victorians weren't just odd in public. Their private entertainments reveal something deeper. They were obsessed with controlling life and death, with transforming boredom into spectacle, with laughing at danger or flirting with the forbidden. When they played with fire, and you, sitting here with me tonight, can almost feel it, can't you? The flicker of gaslight, the giggle of a woman in insect wings, the hush as the table trembles under your fingertips, the faint smell of formaldehyde from the squirrel in a waistcoat. You're not just hearing about it too, in the room. And doesn't it feel unsettling? Deliciously so. Because that's the truth of Victorian fun. It wasn't just distraction. It was performance. It was identity. It was the thin veil between respectability and madness. Picture it. You step out of the cozy Victorian drawing room, shake off the smell of musty curtains and taxidermy tea parties, and suddenly you're in the middle of the street. And the street isn't quiet. It's alive, wild, chaotic almost. Dangerous. Because in the Victorian world, fun didn't stay inside parlors. It spilled out, grabbed the public by the throat, and sometimes turned into riots, disguised as festivals. Take the Guy Fawkes Night celebrations. Sure, today you think of fireworks, kids with sparklers, maybe a polite bonfire. But back then, absolute mayhem. Crowds paraded effigies through the streets, sometimes Guy Fawkes, sometimes unpopular politicians, sometimes even the Pope hand, then burned them in towering flames. Drunken mobs cheered, fireworks shot into windows, fights broke out. In alleyways, it was less community bonding and more mob psychology 101. If you didn't join in, you risked your house being pelted with rocks for being a killjoy. Or how about election day fun? Imagine voting, but instead of quiet booths and ballot secrecy, It was a carnival of bribery, free beer, and fistfights. Politicians literally handed out barrels of alcohol to win favor, so voters staggered to the polls, drunk and ready to brawl. Riots erupted, taverns overflowed, and entire neighborhoods turned into one giant, violent block party. Democracy looked less like civic duty and more like a demolition derby with top hats. And then there were the rag parades. These weren't organized by the rich. They were street carnivals thrown by working-class communities, where people dressed in wild costumes, painted their faces, and paraded through the streets, banging on pots, pans, and drums. Sometimes it was hilarious. Sometimes it was threatening. These parades mocked authority, turning respectable norms upside down. Imagine a line of chimney sweeps dressed as bishops, blessing the crowd with soot. Imagine women dressed as soldiers, smoking pipes, marching like men. It was satire, but it was also rebellion disguised as entertainment. Now, let's not forget the chivalry. Oh, this one is nasty. If your neighbors disapproved of you, maybe you married too young, too old, too fast, or too scandalously, the community might throw you a rough music parade. They'd march outside your house at night, clanging pots, blowing horns, shouting insults. Sometimes they dragged an effigy of you through the streets and burned it. And here's the kicker. Everyone treated it as fun. Imagine trying to sleep while your entire town mocked your marriage with a marching band of chaos. It was bullying, as community theater. And then we get to the most bizarre public fun of all, mock executions. Yes, you heard that right. Sometimes festivals included reenactments of hangings or beheadings, not with real victims, but with dummies or volunteers. In costume, crowds roared with laughter, children cheered, and everyone treated death as slapstick. In a society where real public executions were still fresh in living memory. This was their way of keeping the spectacle alive. But here's where it gets even darker. Not all street fun was just parody. Sometimes it tipped into real violence. Take Shrove Tuesday football. Calling it football as misleading it was more like a war game. Hundreds of men from different sides of town battled over a ball, smashing through markets, fields, and homes. There were no rules. People got trampled, shops destroyed, bones broken. The fun ended only when exhaustion or serious injury stopped the crowd. Think rugby, but played by an angry mob. And if you think that's wild, let's talk about rioting as entertainment. It sounds insane, but many Victorians treated riots the way modern people treat concerts. Crowds gathered, cheered at the chaos, even brought their families to watch. When political protests or workers' strikes turned violent, onlookers climbed rooftops for the best view. For some, it wasn't about politics at all. It was about being part of the spectacle, feeling the thrill of danger without necessarily throwing the punch. The irony is that Victorians loved to lecture about morality and order. Yet their streets pulsed with events that looked more like anarchy dressed in costumes. And the people loved it. You would have loved it too, standing there in the gaslight, shoulder to shoulder with a laughing crowd, your ears ringing from the drums and fireworks. Your heart racing because you couldn't tell if tonight was a carnival or a riot. Now here's the question that gnaws at you. Why? Why did Victorians, so uptight in manners and morals, dive headfirst into such chaos when it came to fun? Was it rebellion? Was it a release valve? Was it the thrill of stepping outside the suffocating rules of society, if only for a night? That's the secret of Victorian street fun. It blurred the line between play and protest, entertainment and eruption. It let people taste freedom in a world where every other hour of the day demanded discipline. And as you stand there with me tonight, in the thick of the crowd, you realize something. This isn't just Casey and 13 left us. This time pulling you into the velvet-draped theaters of Victoria's story. It's a mirror. Because maybe, just maybe, we haven't changed that much. All right, my friend, wipe the soot off your coat from the riot outside. Because we're stepping through the grand carved doors of a Victorian theater. And trust me, this isn't like catching a Netflix series or munching popcorn at a cinema. This is rowdy, risky, and dripping with scandal. You don't just watch the performance, you become part of the madness. The first thing that hits you is the smell. The theater reeks of perfume, sweat, cigars, and damp wool. You squeeze through the crowd, and already, you feel the divide. Up in the private boxes, the wealthy preen, whisper, and show off their jewels like peacocks. Down in the pit, absolute chaos. Men yell at the actors, stamp their feet, throw orange peels when bored. It's not theater etiquette. It's a bar fight with Shakespeare as the background. Victorians didn't go to the theater just for art. They went for the thrill. They wanted drama on the stage, yes, but also off the stage. And boy, did they get it. Imagine actors being booed, mid-scene hecklers, screaming insults, or drunks climbing onto the stage to join the play uninvited. Performances stopped dead because fights erupted in the pit. Sometimes the theater manager had to call in police, just to keep the audience from destroying the place. But here's where things get deliciously bizarre. Victorians loved the scandalous plays. The racier, the better. If a play hinted at adultery, cross-dressing, or immoral love, the house packed full. They wanted to gasp, clutch their pearls, and then whisper about it afterward, like giddy teenagers. Censorship was strict, but clever playwrights found ways to sneak in double meanings. Audiences came not just for the story, but for the chance to see society's forbidden desires acted out before their very eyes. And then there were the famous actors and actresses, the celebrities of the day. Oh, they weren't just performers. They were objects of obsession. Fans mobbed their carriages, fought over locks of their hair, even broke into their dressing rooms. Some wealthy men sponsored actresses in exchange for private favors, blurring the line between theater and brothel. Being an actress in Victorian London meant walking a razor's edge between stardom and scandal. Now, let me paint you one of the most bizarre theater traditions, the pantomime. This wasn't your polite Christmas play. It was a riot of costumes, slapstick, body jokes, and gender-bending roles. Men played women, women played men, and the audience ate it up. Kids shrieked with laughter. Adults roared at the dirty jokes tucked between the lines. The louder, the cruder, the better. Imagine clowns smashing pies while the crowd screamed for more, and you've got the picture. But theaters weren't just fun, they were dangerous. Fires broke out constantly. Packed with wooden sets, gas lamps, and curtains like tinder, these playhouses could go up in flames in minutes. 1 second you're laughing at a pantomime, the next you're clawing your way toward an exit with smoke choking your lungs. Some of the worst Victorian tragedies happened inside theaters, where fun turned to horror in the blink of an eye, and yet, people kept coming back. Why? Because the theater wasn't just about entertainment. It was a place where could push against the rigid boundaries of their lives. By day, you followed the rules, dress properly, speak politely, obey the system. But at night, in a velvet seat with a drink in hand, you could shout, laugh, cry, and even rage. The theater gave Victorians something their strict society denied them. Release. But hold on, I've saved the strangest for last. Have you heard of theaters of anatomy? Yes, that's right. Some Victorians treated dissections as entertainment. They sat in lecture halls designed like theaters, watching surgeons cut into corpses. Tickets were sold, audiences cheered or fainted, and students scribbled notes. Death wasn't hidden, it was performed. Imagine sitting in a crowd, the smell of chemicals in the air, as a doctor lifted a human heart for everyone to see. For Victorians, this was both education and spectacle. Creepy, absolutely. But fascinating. Oh yes, so here's the scene, my friend. You and I are sitting in a Victorian theater. The crowd restless, the air thick with smoke and gossip. A scandalous actress steps onto the stage, her dress tighter than morality allows. The crowd erupts, boos, whistles. Behind us, a drunk heckler stands and shouts, "Off with her," while a boy in the balcony pelts the pit with nutshells. And then suddenly a fire breaks out backstage. Panic. Screams. People shoving, trampling, rushing for the doors. Fun turns to fear in a heartbeat. That's Victorian entertainment in a nutshell. Thrilling, scandalous, but always one spark away from disaster. All right, my friend, grab your hat and don't scream when the lights flicker, because we're walking straight into a Victorian séance. You know how today people binge horror movies or play with Ouija boards at sleepovers? Well, Victorians took That idea turned the dial to 11 and added velvet drapes, candle smoke, and a faint smell of gin. The moment you step into a parlor hosting a seance, the mood shifts. The curtains are drawn, the only light comes from trembling candles, and everyone sits around a polished mahogany table. Hands clasp, breath slows, and then the medium begins her act. Maybe she hums, maybe she rocks, maybe her eyes roll back like she's possessed. Suddenly, the table shudders. A bell rings from nowhere. And you swear on your boots. You feel a ghostly hand brush against your neck. Victorians ate this stuff up. Why? Because they lived in a world haunted by death. Diseases swept through cities, children died young, and life expectancy was depressingly short. Funerals were practically family reunions. So the idea that you could talk to dead Uncle Henry over tea. Comforting, thrilling, terrifying, all at once. But seances weren't just about comfort, they were spectacle. Mediums were showmen and showwomen who knew how to dazzle. They made tables float, objects fly, ghostly figures appear in corners. And yes, most of it was trickery, hidden wires, assistance in sheets, clever use of mirrors. But for the audience, it didn't matter. They wanted the thrill. They wanted to gasp, cry, laugh nervously, and leave the room whispering, "Did you feel that too? Let me tell you about the ectoplasm trick." Oh, this one's a classic. Mediums would claim they could exude ectoplasm. The spiritual goo ghosts used to manifest. So during a seance, they'd gag, cough, and suddenly, out of their mouth would spill cheesecloth, or gauze, or bits of muslin soaked in egg whites to make it look slimy. The lights were dim, the atmosphere charged, and people swore they were witnessing a supernatural miracle. It was gross, ridiculous, and utterly convincing to anyone desperate to believe. And of course, there was always the ghost photography craze. Imagine Victorians lining up to have their portrait taken only to discover a faint ghost hovering behind them. Ooh, spooky. Except the ghosts were just double exposures. Photographic trickery by clever entrepreneurs. But people didn't care. They framed those photos, showed them off to friends, and bragged that Grandma had dropped in from the afterlife to say hello. Now, don't think this was all harmless fun. Seances could get intense. Imagine you're sitting in the dark, listening. Two strange knocks and whispers. Suddenly, someone screams. A woman faints. A man swears he saw a hand reach out of the wall. Panic spreads like wildfire. Some seances ended in chaos, with overturned tables, broken chairs, and guests fleeing into the night. But here's the kicker: Victorians wanted that chaos. They weren't satisfied with polite parlor games. They wanted fear. Real gut fear. It was the same impulse that drove them to pack theaters for Gothic plays full of ghosts, murderers, and blood. They craved the adrenaline, the shiver down the spine, the thrill of standing on the edge of the unknown. And speaking of Gothic plays, let's not forget the penny dreadfuls. Oh, these were the comic books of Victorian London, cheap, sensational stories sold for a penny. Titles like Varney the Vampire, The String of Pearls which gave us Sweeney Todd, and The Mysteries of London. They were gory, dramatic, and absolutely addictive. Imagine kids huddled under gaslight, flipping through stories of murderers, monsters, and the undead, their imaginations running wild. For many Victorians, this was their first taste of horror. But wait, it gets weirder. Ever hear of the ghost clubs? Oh yes. Secret societies formed purely to investigate the supernatural. Wealthy gentlemen, professors, even scientists, sat around debating ghost sightings, investigating haunted houses, and attending seances, like detectives chasing phantoms. Some clubs were deadly serious. Others were basically excuses for men to drink brandy and scare each other with campfire tales. Either way, it shows just how obsessed the Victorians were with blurring the line between entertainment and the afterlife. And then, there's the most bizarre Victorian horror pastime of all, public ghost tours. Guides would lead crowds through dark alleys and graveyards, spinning tales of murderers, suicides, and restless spirits. Picture a tour walking under the flickering light of a lantern, the guide whispering about the ghost of a murdered woman who still cries for her child. The wind howls, a cat screeches, and suddenly the whole group screams in terror. fun. For Victorians, absolutely. But here's the twist, just as many people came to mock as to believe. The supernatural scene was filled with skeptics. Magicians like Harry Houdini later exposed mediums as frauds, showing how every trick could be explained with wires, mirrors, and sleight of hand. And yet, even knowing it was fake, the thrill never died. Because Victorians weren't really chasing the truth. They were chasing the experience, so picture this. You and I are sitting in that candlelit room. The medium groans, the table shakes, and suddenly, a ghostly face floats out of the shadows. The crowd gasps. A woman clutches her chest. A man swears under his breath. You lean closer, trying to see if it's real. And just when you think you've figured it out, bang! The candle goes out, and the room plunges into darkness. Someone screams. Someone laughs. And you realize, you're hooked. That, my friend, was Victorian horror as entertainment. Not just stories, not just ghosts, but full-body experiences that made you feel alive by flirting with death. Alright, picture this. It's Saturday night. You've got a shilling in your pocket. And instead of heading to the theater, you wander into a cramped hall, glowing with lantern light. The posters outside scream words like marvel, wonder, see the human curiosities, and what's waiting inside. Not actors, not musicians, but people, real people, displayed as entertainment. Welcome, my friend, to the Victorian Freak Show. Now, today the very idea sounds cruel, and trust me, a lot of it was. But in Victorian times, this was peak entertainment. People lined up to see bearded ladies, tattooed men, giants, dwarfs, conjoined twins, and performers with unusual bodies or skills. To the Victorians, it wasn't just curiosity, it was an escape. Life was hard, repetitive, and suffocating. But here, in these exhibitions, they could glimpse the strange, the exotic, the impossible. Let's start with one of the most famous names in the business, P.T. Barnum. Yep, the man later known as the Greatest Showman. Barnum knew Victorians, and Americans too, couldn't resist a spectacle. He exhibited performers like Charles Stratton, better known as General Tom Thumbadorf, with sharp wit and impeccable showmanship, who became an international celebrity. Barnum even paraded so-called mermaids, which were actually grotesque. Taxidermy mashups of monkey corpses sewn onto fishtails. Gross, yes. Believed by some. Also yes, the Victorian obsession with the unusual went beyond the physical. Performers, like the tattooed man, covered head to toe in ink. Thrilled audiences who saw tattoos as strange, exotic, and borderline scandalous. There were sword swallowers, fire eaters, and contortionists bending their bodies in ways that seemed supernatural. For Victorians, every show was a collision of shock, awe, and nervous laughter. But here's where it gets more twisted. Beyond freak shows were human zoos. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Entire exhibitions of people from colonized countries were put on display, often dressed in stereotypical costumes, forced to perform daily tasks or rituals for gawking crowds. Victorians convinced themselves this was educational, a glimpse into foreign cultures. In reality, it was dehumanizing, exploitative, and one of the darker sides of their hunger for spectacle. Now let's not pretend audiences were always passive. Oh, no, sometimes the freak shows backfired. Imagine you're in the front row, laughing at the strongman performer. Then he casually bends a steel bar in half and throws it at your feet, just to make you flinch. Audiences loved the danger. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, these curiosities were more powerful than the ones gawking at them, of course. The Victorians dressed all this up as science. They didn't just gawk, they measured skulls, catalogued bodies, and whispered about evolution. This was the era of Darwin, after all, when people were desperately trying to make sense of humanity's place in nature. Freak shows became a way to poke at the boundaries of normal, to test what it meant to be human. And in some twisted way, the audiences reassured themselves by labeling others as other. But here's the fascinating part. While society called them freaks, many performers used that very label to carve out independence. Think of Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. His life was tragic, yes. But through exhibition, he eventually found sympathy and dignity. He he might never have had hidden away. General Tom Thumb. He became rich, traveled the world, and dined with royalty. The freak show stage was cruel, but for some, it was also opportunity, a paradox the Victorians never fully understood. And the marketing, the marketing. Posters were works of art, bold colors, dramatic fonts, promises of the eighth wonder of the world, or alive, real, and on display. Families would save up coins, drag their kids along, and leave buzzing with stories. You couldn't just watch a freak show, you had to talk about it afterward, spreading its legend, fueling its power. But let me paint you a moment. Imagine stepping into one of those dim halls. You smell sweat, tobacco, and sawdust. A drum roll begins. Curtains sweep aside, and there stands a giant man 7 feet tall, his shadow stretching across the stage. Children gasp. Women clutch their husbands' arms, and then he bows politely and speaks with a gentle, educated voice that completely dismantles the caricature the posters promised. Suddenly, the crowd doesn't know whether to laugh, applaud, or feel ashamed. That awkward tension that was part of the thrilled now, don't get me wrong. This wasn't all applause and excitement. Scandals erupted. Newspapers sometimes accused showmen of fraud, of exploiting the vulnerable, of turning humanity into a circus, and in many ways, they were right. But even scandal was good business. Because what did it do? It made more people come to see for themselves. And guess what? Freak shows weren't only for adults. Kids were dragged along, eyes wide with both fear and fascination. Some went home with nightmares. Others went home dreaming of running away to join the show. Because deep down, Victorians weren't just gawking, they were confronting their own fears. Fear of difference, fear of death, fear of the unknown. And sometimes, that fear felt a lot like fun. But the strangest thing, even as audiences laughed, gasped, and whispered, part of them envied the performers. Because unlike the factory worker, chained to endless labor, these curiosities stood at the center of attention, living lives of adventure and spectacle. In their so-called deformity, they were freer than many normal Victorians ever were. So, the next time you think Victorians spent their nights politely sipping tea, remember, they might also have been packed into a sweaty hall, shrieking, with both laughter and horror, as they gawked at the strangest show in town. Alright, so by now, you've seen Victorians swooning over seances, dressing their pets like dukes, and gawking at tattooed strong men. But tonight, we're pulling the curtain on something darker. Something that makes you realize, deep down the Victorians weren't all that different from ancient Romans. Because for them, fun often came dripping with blood. Now, when I say blood sports, your mind probably jumps to boxing or fencing. But remember, we're talking Victorians. They didn't stop at gentlemanly duels with neat little pistols. At dawn, oh no. They leaned into the brutal, the bizarre, the downright feral. Let's start with rat baiting. Imagine a dingy pub cellar, smoke curling in the air, men shouting and waving money in sweaty fists. In the middle of the room, a pit. And in that pit, dozens of rats, hissing, scrambling, their red eyes flashing in the lantern light. Then release the dog, usually a terrier. Small, fast, relentless. The crowd roared as the dog tore into the swarm, snapping necks, flinging limp bodies. Bets flew fast. 10 shillings, says he clears 50 in under 2 minutes. And the insane part, these matches were timed, recorded, and celebrated like professional sports. Some dogs became legends, their kill counts whispered in pubs like stats for baseball players. And yes, women attended too. Don't picture delicate ladies fainting at the sight. Some leaned over the pits with a gleam in their eyes, enjoying the carnage as much as the men. Victorian society loved its split personalities. You could be genteel in the drawing room and bloodthirsty in the cellar, if rat baiting wasn't enough. How about bear baiting and badger baiting? Now, technically, bear baiting had been outlawed by the time Queen Victoria sat on the throne. But you know how that goes. Outlawed doesn't mean stopped. In hidden yards and backwoods pits, bears were chained and set upon by packs of dogs, cheered on by sweaty crowds. The brutality was part of the thrill. If you didn't flinch, you weren't really there. And let's not forget bare-knuckle boxing. Forget the gloves and rules you know today. This was stripped down, raw, bone-cracking combat. Matches went on, for dozens of rounds, until one man was either unconscious or too broken to stand. Blood sprayed, teeth flew, and the audience loved every second. Victorians saw this as the ultimate test of masculinity. Pain, endurance, and violence as proof of manhood. To them, the winner wasn't just strong, he was heroic. The loser, well, he was just another body on the floor. And then there were duels. Now, these weren't the cinematic, tidy turn-and-shoot affairs you see in movies. Victorian duels were often messy, impulsive, and carried out in secret gardens, alleys, or abandoned fields. Sometimes pistols were used, sometimes swords, sometimes just fists and fury, fueled by brandy and bruised pride. The upper classes pretended these were about honor, but let's be honest, it was theater. A duel was as much performance as punishment. The audience, yes, people watched, held their breath, waiting for that single, fatal shot or sword thrust. But let's get even darker. Because some Victorians took their hunger for violent spectacle straight into the underground world of illegal prize fights. Imagine stumbling into a barn lit by lanterns, the smell of hay, sweat, and cheap liquor choking the air. Two men stripped at the waist circle each other, fists up, faces already swollen. The referee's rules were basically, don't die too fast. The crowd pressed so close, their boots touched the edge of the fighting ring, shouting, betting, spitting, demanding more blood. If you've ever wondered what fun looked like for someone who worked 6 days in a factory with death always a whisper away, this was it. Watching someone else bleed made them feel alive. And here's the kicker. Animal cruelty as entertainment wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Dogfights, cockfights, even cat versus dog matches were all staples of Victorian underground fun. Posters advertised them, bookmakers took bets, and police often looked the other way. The Victorians wrapped themselves in lace and manners, but their basements were dripping with savagery. But not all the violence was in pits and barns. Sometimes it was on the very streets. Public executions may have been dwindling by Victoria's reign, but the echoes were still there. Crowds of thousands used to gather to watch hangings, treating them like festivals. Vendors sold pies and gin, while children sat on their father's shoulders, watching a condemned man choked to death. By the time executions went private, Victorians still longed for that public spectacle, and blood sports became their substitute. Now, here's the twisted irony. While Victorians gorged on violence for fun, they also moralized against it in print. Newspapers published editorials wringing their hands about the decline of morals, the cruelty of animal sports, the barbarism of dueling, and then right next to the editorial, they'd print breathless coverage of the latest illegal fight, describing every broken rib and bloodied face in loving detail. Hypocrisy, oh absolutely. But that contradiction is the essence of Victorian entertainment. Publicly condemn it, privately crave it, and let's not forget the whispers that surrounded these bloody entertainments. Some people swore the violence wasn't just fun, it was spiritual. They claimed it purged society, allowed men to test their mettle, or kept dangerous instincts out of the drawing room. To them, a rat pit wasn't barbarism, was release. Now, imagine yourself there. You're in a smoky pub, the crowd pressing in, shouting, coins rattling. The terrier leaps into the pit, teeth flashing, rats squealing. The frenzy rises, you're caught in it, your heart pounding with both disgust and exhilaration. You didn't want to watch, but you can't look away. And when it's over, when the last rat lies still and the dog licks its bloody muzzle, you stagger out into the cool night. The silence feels deafening, and yet, part of you wants to go back in. Because that's what the Victorians understood, maybe better than we do. Violence wasn't just horror. It was thrill. It was fun. It was life, compressed into a single, brutal spectacle. By now you've seen the Victorians chasing thrills in blood pits and boxing rings. But here's the strange truth. Sometimes, their idea of fun wasn't about life at all, it was about death. Because no culture before or since has been quite so obsessed with mourning, funerals, and the afterlife as the Victorians. Let's start with the basics. Death was everywhere in the 1800s. Disease, poverty, industrial accidents, life expectancy was short. And the reaper was never far. Instead of hiding it away like we do today, Victorians dragged death straight into their drawing rooms. They didn't just mourn, they made it a lifestyle. Picture this: someone in the family dies. Immediately, the house transforms into a stage, set for grief. Mirrors covered with black cloth, clocks stopped at the hour of death, windows draped in heavy curtains. And then came the costumes. The widow, in particular, was expected to wear deep black crepe, heavy veils, and even black gloves, not just for a week or two, sometimes for years. Whole wardrobes of mourning clothes were sold in London shops, as fashionable and as coveted as evening gowns. But here's the twist: mourning became a form of public theater. Your neighbors judged you not only for how you lived, but for how you mourned. Did you wear enough black? Did you avoid parties long enough? Did your sobs sound sincere? In Victorian society, death wasn't just personal, it was social currency. If you mourned correctly, you proved your virtue. If you didn't, you were branded heartless. And from this culture of mourning came one of the most chilling forms of Victorian entertainment: post-mortem photography. Think about this. Photography was expensive and rare in the 19th century. Most families never had the chance to capture their loved ones on film while alive. So when someone died, families rushed to hire photographers to pose the corpse as if still living. Children propped in chairs with toys. Babies held upright by hidden stands. Adults reclined as if peacefully napping. Eyes painted onto closed lids to make them seem awake. These images weren't grotesque to Victorians, they were treasures. People proudly displayed them in albums, even on mantelpieces, and invited guests to look for us. It's unsettling. For them, it was the last chance to capture a face before the earth swallowed it. But death entertainment went further. There were mourning parties. Picture a parlor filled with guests, dressed in somber black, sipping tea, nibbling cake, discussing the recently departed in hushed, reverent tones. Sometimes music was played slow, mournful pieces, designed to tug at the heart. These gatherings weren't gloomy to Victorians, they were society events. Invitations were sent, seating arranged, rituals followed. Mourning became another excuse for performance, a kind of macabre social gathering. And then there was hair art. Yes, actual hair taken from the deceased, woven into intricate jewelry, brooches, wreaths, or lockets. These weren't hidden mementos, they were flaunted. A woman might proudly wear a pendant containing her dead husband's hair. A family might hang a framed wreath made entirely from the braids of their dead children. It wasn't creepy to them, it was tender, a way to keep loved ones literally close to the heart. But if you walked into a Victorian home, you might sit down for tea beneath a wreath that was, quite literally, made of the dead. And while mourning dominated private homes, funerals themselves were public spectacles. Coffins carved with ornate detail. Funeral processions parading through the streets with horse-drawn hearses draped in plumes and velvet. Professional mourners were even hired to wail dramatically, their job to amplify grief so the family looked appropriately devastated. The bigger the show, the more respect you earned. Death wasn't just an ending. It was your family's final chance to make a statement. Now here's the shadowy underbelly. The Victorians' obsession with death gave rise to ghoulish industries. Undertakers inflated prices, knowing grief families would pay anything. Mourning shops sold overpriced black clothes, veils, jewelry, and in the back alleys, body snatchers made fortunes selling corpses to medical schools for dissection. Ordinary Victorians whispered about resurrection men who dug up fresh graves by lantern light, sometimes while relatives of the dead were still in mourning garb. Some families even built iron cages called mort safes, so for graves to keep the corpse thieves away. But perhaps the strangest twist of all was the Victorians' hunger for ghosts. Death wasn't final to them. It was a doorway. Seances, spirit photography, mediums, they weren't fringe pastimes. They were mainstream. Respectable families would sit in darkened parlors, hands clasped around a table, waiting for the knock of a spirit. Raps, flickering candles, floating trumpet soul became thrilling entertainment. And in their minds, this wasn't silly superstition. It was a way to keep death close, to to make the afterlife part of daily life. It's easy for us to sneer, but think about it. When death takes your children, your parents, your spouse, when disease sweeps through cities and cemeteries overflow, you don't run from death. You dance with it. You make it part of the story. You make it entertaining, because the alternative is unbearable. Now, put yourself there. Imagine walking into a Victorian parlor. A coffin sits in the center of the room. Around it, women in black veils sip tea, nodding solemnly, whispering about the deceased's virtues. On the wall, a wreath made of their hair glimmers in the candlelight. And in the corner, a photographer arranges his equipment, preparing to immortalize the corpse for one final portrait. To us, it's nightmare fuel. To them, it's comfort. It's connection. It's culture. This was Victorian entertainment, at its strangest, where grief became fashion. Funerals became theater, and death itself was invited to sit at the table. You've sat with the Victorians in their parlors of mourning, sipping tea beneath wreaths made of human hair. Now let's leave the death-draped drawing rooms and march into the noisy, chaotic world of freak shows where entertainment was loud, crowded, and unapologetically human. Picture it, the mid to late 1800s. When traveling circuses and carnivals were booming, posters plastered across city walls shouted promises of giants, bearded ladies, two-headed marvels. The freak show was Victorian reality TV, equal parts scandal, curiosity, and guilty pleasure. The Victorians were obsessed with difference. Anything outside the neat little boxes of normal society, whether bodies, behaviors, or talents, became a spectacle. They didn't call it cruelty. They called it curiosity, science, even education. But make no mistake, they paid money to gawk at people's bodies. Let's start with the stars. The bearded lady. Women like Annie Jones, born in 1865, grew long facial hair due to conditions like hirsutism. Instead of hiding, they were displayed on stage, dressed in fine gowns, holding parasols, and introduced as exotic wonders. Victorian audiences gasped, whispered, giggled, and paid again and again to stare. The giants, men and women with gigantism, often standing over 7 feet tall, were paraded as living proof of biblical tales like Goliath. They towered over crowds, posed for photographs with normal people half their size, and were advertised as walking miracles. The small people, the opposite extreme, drew equal fascination. Performers with dwarfism, like General Tom Thumb, one of P.T. Barnum's biggest stars, became global celebrities. Tom Thumb toured Europe, performed for royalty, and made a fortune, all because his body didn't fit Victorian norms. And then there were the Siamese twins. Chang and Engbunker, conjoined twins from Siam, modern-day Thailand, became international sensations. Exhibited in America and Europe, they were displayed as both marvels and oddities. But they weren't just passive exhibits. They grew wealthy, married sisters, and fathered over 20 children. Their fame blurred the line between exploitation and empowerment. But not every performer had control. Many were poor, marginalized, or disabled, forced into contracts that treated them like property. Circuses and showmen spun tales origins, inventing exotic backstories, claiming performers were wild people from faraway lands. The freak show wasn't just about bodies, it was about storytelling. Audiences weren't just buying tickets to stare. They were buying myths, and Victorian society loved it because the freak show scratched to deep cultural itches, fear and fascination. Fear, because anything different threatened rigid social norms. Fascination, because the Victorians were secretly obsessed with bodies, sex, and the limits of human nature. The freak show let them stare without guilt, because it was framed as science or education. Some exhibits weren't even human. Mermaids cobbled together from monkey torsos and fishtails. Wild men of Borneo who were actually just small, muscular men in costumes. Entire tents filled with hoaxes. But here's the trick. Audiences knew some of it was fake, and that was part of the fun. The line between truth and fraud was blurry, and Victorians reveled in that ambiguity. Now imagine walking into one of these tents. Gas lamps flicker, casting shadows across painted banners. A barker shouts promises of wonders beyond imagination. You pay your shilling, push through the crowd, and there she is. A bearded lady in lace, smiling as whispers ripple through the crowd. Behind her a living skeleton, a man weighing scarcely 70 pounds, sits in a chair, his bones sharp. Beneath his skin, children gasp, women clutch parasols, men grin and elbow each other. You're not just watching them, you're participating in a cultural ritual, the ritual of gawking. But beneath the gawking was a darker truth. Many of these performers lived hard lives. Some made fortunes, yes, but others died penniless, abandoned by the very audiences who once cheered them. The freak show gave visibility and money to a few, but it also exploited human suffering on a massive scale. And yet, for Victorians, it was thrilling, safe, controlled, a way to confront the strangeness of the human body, without ever having to face their own fears of difference. For the price of a ticket, you could stare death, deformity, and biology in the face and then walk back into the ordinary world, reassured you were normal. But the freak show didn't just stop at physical bodies. Victorians wanted more. They wanted mental curiosities. They paid to see people with unusual talents, fast talkers, lightning calculators, men who could memorize entire books. They wanted to see madness put on display, too. Patients from asylums were sometimes exhibited like animals in a zoo, under the guise of public education. It was voyeurism, dressed up as morality. And here's the kicker. Freak shows weren't just about curiosity. They were about control. By putting different bodies on display, Victorians reassured themselves of their own place in the social hierarchy. You were normal because someone else was freakish. You were safe because someone else was strange. But let's not pretend we're above it. Today, we don't have bearded ladies in tents. We have reality TV, viral YouTube videos, TikToks that turn human struggle into spectacle. The Victorian freak show never really died, it just changed costumes. Still, for Victorians, the freak show was a nightly thrill. The gaslights, the banners, the whispers of scandal, it was a mirror held up to their deepest curiosities and darkest fears. You've seen the Victorians laugh at freak shows, but now let's dim the lamps, pull the curtains tight, and sit in the hush of a seance parlor. This wasn't loud entertainment, it was quiet, electric, charged with the promise that the veil between worlds could be lifted if you only sat still enough, believed hard enough, and handed over enough coins to the medium. The Victorians were obsessed with death. They couldn't stop thinking about it, decorating with it, photographing it. And when science started pushing religion into a corner, when Darwin whispered that maybe man was just another animal, Victorians turned to spiritualism for comfort. If the church couldn't guarantee your soul, maybe the medium could. Picture it. A middle-class family, gathered in a darkened room. Candles burn low. The air feels thick. A woman in a black dress, always dramatic, always in mourning attire, places her hands on the table. Everyone else follows. Fingers touch. Silence. Then a knock. Another. The table shivers. Gasps ripple through the room. "Is that you, Mother?" a trembling voice asks, and the medium smiles faintly. Yes, she is. Here the seance was theater, disguised as religion. Mediums mastered stage tricks, hidden wires to rattle furniture, assistants concealed in closets to make mysterious noises, phosphorus paint to create glowing spirits in the dark. Sometimes they even swallowed cheesecloth and rigged it during the seance, claiming it was ectoplasm, the physical substance of ghosts. Yes, Victorians clapped for vomit. Try not to judge. TikTok isn't much better. But the tricks didn't matter, because the seance wasn't about science, it was about hope. Every knock, every flicker of light, every floating trumpet, was proof at least for one evening that death wasn't final. Some seances were small, intimate affairs in private parlors. Others were public spectacles, held in packed theaters. Famous mediums like the Fox sisters in America, or Daniel Dunglaw's home in Britain, drew thousands. Home was legendary. He supposedly levitated in front of audiences, floating out a window, and back into another. Witnesses swore it was real. Skeptics claimed trickery. But the point was, people wanted to believe. And here's the kicker, the Victorians didn't see a contradiction in this. They could be obsessed with rational science by day, and utterly bewitched by ghosts at night. That's what made spiritualism so powerful. It was a bridge between the cold, clinical world of science and the aching human need for magic. Now, seances weren't just about dead relatives. They were also about power. Women, who had little authority in the public sphere, suddenly had influence in the seance room. The most famous mediums were female, and their audiences hung on their every whispered word. A woman who could barely sign a legal contract could summon the dead and silence a room of powerful men. For a few hours, she controlled the narrative. Of course, not everyone was enchanted. Scientists investigated seances relentlessly. Stage magicians, like Harry Houdini, later exposed trick after trick. The Fox sisters, the pioneers of the movement, eventually confessed that their ghostly knocks were made by cracking their toe joints under the table. And yet, even after the confessions, believers remained. Why? Because sometimes people don't want truth. They want comfort. And let's be honest, Victorians loved the drama. Mediums often worked in pitch-black rooms because spirits disliked light, which, conveniently, also made trickery invisible. Some produced glowing hands that reached out of the dark. Others materialized ghostly figures from cabinets' assistants in white sheets, revealed only in fleeting candlelight. People screamed, fainted, wept. They weren't just attending a seance. They were starring in a supernatural play. But seances weren't only for the drawing room curious. They were big business. Mediums charged hefty fees, held repeat sessions, sold photographs of ghosts captured on camera, and published books of their revelations. Spiritualism became a movement, complete with societies, conventions, and even attempts to prove it scientifically. The Victorian seance was more than just a party trick. It was a cultural phenomenon. It gave the grieving mother hope, the curious gentleman a thrill, and the disillusioned scientist a taste of wonder. It was faith without church, magic without guilt, theater without admitting it was theater. Now pause for a second. Imagine you're there. The gas lights are low. The air smells faintly of smoke and wax. You're holding hands with strangers. The medium whispers, her eyes rolling back, her voice suddenly deeper as if someone else is speaking through her. The table tilts. A trumpet floats in the dark, spinning in the air. Someone sobs, "Papa, is it you?" And the hairs on your arms rise. Because whether it's real or not, in that moment, you believe, and that's the trick. The seance wasn't about proving ghosts were real. It was about creating an experience so emotionally powerful that it didn't matter if it was fake. For the Victorians, belief was entertainment, and entertainment was belief. But don't get too cozy, because there's a twist coming. The same Victorians who whispered to the dead also filled their free time with something shockingly opposite: violent, brutal, and very, very alive. You've just left the seance room. The hush of whispered prayers, the flickering candlelight, the trembling belief that the dead were close, it's all still clinging to you. But outside, the night air is harsh, smoky, and alive with noise. And if you followed the wrong crowd, you'd soon find yourself not in a quiet parlor of spirits, but in the rowdy, stinking heart of a Victorian bloodsport pit. And oh friend, welcome to rat-baiting. Yes, you heard me right. Victorians thought it was hilarious entertainment to cram a pit full of rats, sometimes 100 at a time, and throw in a dog, to see how fast it could kill them all. The audience, drunk and sweaty, roared with laughter and laid down bets. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a game of timing, wagers, and bragging rights. Picture it, a small, circular pit, lit by oil lamps, surrounded by smoke-filled air, and men with tankards of ale in hand. The rats squeal, their bodies writhing in a seething mess. Then the dog, usually a terrier bred for speed and ferocity's thrown in. The crowd counts out loud, cheering each snap of the dog's jaws, each kill. The fastest dog could dispatch 100 rats in under 5 minutes. Imagine the frenzy, the squeals, the smell of blood and sawdust. And the crowd loved it. This wasn't some fringe activity either. Rat-baiting pits were everywhere, in taverns, back alleys, even beneath respectable establishments. Betting made it all the more exciting. Gentlemen wagered on dogs like they were racehorses. Entire reputations were built on owning the fastest rat killer, and the best dogs became local celebrities, their names whispered with admiration in beer halls across the city. But it didn't stop at rats. Victorians escalated everything. They wanted more blood, more noise, more spectacle, which is why they also flocked to dog fights. Two animals, locked in a savage battle, cheered on by a screaming mob. It was brutal, barbaric, and, for the Victorians, it was sport. Here's where it gets even more bizarre. This wasn't just a pastime for the poor. Aristocrats came too. Men in fine coats, sipping expensive brandy, would sit elbow to elbow with dock workers, both of them hollering at the snarling chaos in the pit. It was one of the few places in Victorian England where class lines blurred, united by the thrill of violence. And yet, for all their obsession with decency and moral order, Victorians didn't find this shocking. It was entertainment. It was tradition. The same society that swooned at poetry readings also clapped when dogs tore each other apart. But blood sports weren't confined to animals. There was another arena, one that Victorians loved even more. Bare-knuckle boxing. Forget the gloved, regulated sport you know today. This was raw, savage fighting, sometimes lasting dozens of rounds, until one man was beaten so badly he couldn't rise again. Fighters were national heroes, drawing massive crowds. They were tough, scarred, brutal men who trained not in gyms but in the filth of the streets. And their matches weren't just fights, they were festivals. Thousands gathered, sometimes illegally, to watch men batter each other bloody. And here's where it gets interesting. The same Victorians who clutched pearls about morality in public, who fainted at the sight of a woman showing ankle, would pay good money to watch two men smash each other's faces in. But the pits had a darker side. Not everyone who stepped in came out. There were stories of dogs torn to pieces, fighters crippled for life, spectators injured in riots when bets went sour. And yet, the appetite for blood only grew. Now why? Why would a society so obsessed with manners, etiquette, and refinement also indulge in such barbarity? The answer is simple. They were bored. Life was rigid, rules were suffocating, and for the working class especially, there were few outlets for release. Bloodsports gave them that release, a place where anger, excitement, and raw human energy could erupt unchecked. And for the upper classes, it was a guilty thrill. They could cloak themselves in civility by day, then sneak into the pits at night, and let their darker instincts run free. It was the ultimate double-life tea, with the vicar on Sunday, dogfights on Monday. You might be shaking your head right now, thinking, how could they cheer for something so cruel? But then again, don't we do the same, just with different packaging? Victorians had rat-baiting pits. We have violent sports, extreme wrestling, or movies dripping with blood. The craving hasn't gone away, it's just evolved. Still, there's something about those Victorian pits that feels more honest. They didn't pretend it was art. They didn't dress it up. It was raw, filthy, unfiltered violence. And maybe that's why it drew such massive crowds. But hold on, because the Victorians didn't stop at rats, dogs, or men. Their hunger for bizarre entertainment had another, even stranger outlet. One that wasn't about blood at all, but about bodies, and not living ones either.